Hey guys, what's up? Hope you're doing all right. Welcome back to my shop. I hope you're ready for today's video because I'm about to show you how to make a cutting board of your very own, unlike anything you've ever seen.
Hey, if you're ready to raise your hands up. This what rock and roll looks like. Yeah, wearing leather and lace. Raise your hands up.
Now, let me start off by saying that making a cutting board like this one is not for the faint of heart. It is going to require a little bit of patience and time. You're not going to be able to make this as fast as a standard ingrain cutting board, but do like I show in the video, and if your joints even aren't quite right, I'll show you a tip later on in the video on how to make your board look perfect. Now, these particular boards, you can use whatever kind of wood species that you want. I'm using walnut, purple heart, and cherry. It seems to give a subtle contrast between all three boards. However, if you want a high contrast, maybe throw some hard maple instead of cherry in there. Now, to start off, you want to mill up your boards 1 3/4 inches thick by 2 3/4 inches wide. That'll give you plenty of milling room at the router table. I've taken all these pieces over after I figured out how I want them laid out, and I've cut the specific pieces that I want with a 3/8 inch wide dado blade raised up to 3/4 of an inch. And then I've cleared out a path, flipping it end for end to make sure that it's good and centered. Now I've brought it over to the router, and I'm going to use a white side dovetail bit with a 7-degree angle, and I'm going to finish out these dovetail mortises and tails so they will slip together and create a sliding dovetail for every piece that's going to be adjoining. Alright guys, the grooves are now cut like I said before, and I've got the dovetail bit in the router. I did have to wait on an 8mm adapter collet to go in my 1/2 inch collet because I didn't have one, and the dovetail bit is a little bit bigger than a 1/4 shank. So now that I've got that done, I'm going to just take small passes little by little until it creates a perfect dovetail mortise that goes all the way down the length of the board on all the boards that have the groove. Once I'm done with that, I don't change a thing with the router bit height-wise. That is very important. Keep it the same height. Don't change a thing. You should only have to change your fence. So I'll show you that when I get to the point where I've got all these cleared out. Now, one thing I did to help save a lot of time at the router to make these tails is I took it to the table saw and I scribed a line from the very bottom corner where the dovetail is at its widest, and I drew a straight line down to the other edge, and that's where I am cutting to. I'm not quite taking the line, I'm leaving that a little bit just so I don't overcut this, because these things have to be exact. But I removed a lot of that excess wood, so now the router bit can do the rest of the work little by little. Now, making the tails is the same method that you would use to make the mortises. You just flip the piece end for end, taking little by little passes until you create the exact tail to fit the mortise. Now, one thing that I had to do was a little fine tuning on each piece to make sure that it fit its mate properly. So each one of these are put together in a certain way. I can't mix match because of just minor subtleties between these joints because they're so precise. So the glue up for this is going to be a little different than what you would normally do. Because these things slide together, you can't put glue over the entire surface because, as I learned the hard way once, it makes it swell. And it causes the joints to get super tight as they get together, and you may not be able to get it slid all the way on. Not without a little persuasion anyway. So putting glue on half of the surface area on all sides and then taking its mate and sliding it on will take the glue from half of it and push it all the way across. So inevitably you're going to have glue on the entire surface. You just don't have to put it on there. Now, once all the pieces are in, just clamp it up and make sure everything is nice, flat, and secure. Now, after taking these out of the clamps, I've ran them through my surface planer, doing equal passes on both sides just to try and keep the dovetails as centered as possible on the end grain. Now I've ran it through the table saw, just clearing up any rough edges on the ends here. Now the fun begins. Now, with the help of my crosscut sled, I've put a stop block here 1 3/4 away from the kerf. This will allow me planing room once the blank is put together. And hopefully the overall thickness will be 1.5 inches when I'm done. So now we're just going to cut 1 3/4 inch thick strips off of all these blanks. Now, I know there's a bunch of you out there that are saying, how could you cut up such a pretty board? Here's where the fun part of an end grain cutting board comes from. This is beautiful, but This is even more beautiful. How cool is that, people? Not only that, take out every other strip and then combine it with an opposing dovetail, which is the one I did on the second blank. Now, how cool is that? Now, I'm not going to lie to you. The joints on these aren't as perfect as I would like them to be, so I am going to have to do some glue and sawdust putty filling. I don't want to use normal putty. I want to use the dust that actually came from the cutoffs of these so it'll match. But there are some learning curves in doing this, and having sliding dovetails that are continuously tight all the way down the line is the hardest part. I've learned a couple of lessons in doing these, and I'll probably implement those on future boards if I do attempt something like this again. But for the most part, I think they came out great. Now, gluing up an end grain cutting board is really simple. Lay all the face grains up and arrange them in the way that you want. So that way, once the glue is all spread out, all you have to do is turn the pieces and then butt them up to each other and then clamp it up. Very simple. Just make sure that your glue up stays flat. Now, once you take them out of the clamps, take them over to the table saw, and using a crosscut sled, shave off the edges, making sure that everything is nice and flush. Once that's done, save some of the sawdust because you're going to need it. These joints aren't exactly perfect because I had a lot to learn while I did this. So any gaps that I've got to fill, I saved some of the cutoffs from just cutting them off to make them flush. So that way I can ensure that any sawdust that I use is actually going to match the board that I just built. Take some glue with the sawdust in a silicone tray and then mix you up a putty. Now, once you take it out of the clamps, inevitably you're going to have some uneven strips, and it's going to be minimal, but still it's going to happen. If you don't have a drum sander and you don't want to spend a lot of time with your belt sander, running it through your surface planer will do the job. However, a surface planer is going to tear up end grain pretty bad. So in order to combat that, you are going to have to take small, and I mean small, intricate passes to where it's just barely shaving off that board. You don't want to take deep passes because it's going to tear up your blades and your board, and that's one thing you don't want. So in order to combat the tear out that you're going to get, especially on the end grain edges, is to put a trailer piece. A temporary board is basically what it is. You're going to glue it in place on the trail end of the board, and as it goes through the planer, it won't tear out that corner of the board. And then just cut it off on the table saw whenever you're done. Okay, a little disclaimer here, because I know a lot of you are probably bad-mouthing me about using the planer. If you don't have a drum sander, it will save you some time. However, it does tear up that end grain like I mentioned before. I purposely put oil on this particular board so you can see how bad the grain has been opened up by the planer knives. You will have to sand that down with either a belt sander or a random orbit sander and smooth all that back out. You can't really feel it with your hand, but if you tilt the board just so, you can see it with the glare. And it's not something that's attractive to a board. So just take a little bit extra time and sand that down. After running it through the planer, you'll probably notice some of the areas that you filled with your glue and sawdust mixture probably were removed by the planer. It's okay, I did some touch-up work. It was very, very little, but I always want to make sure that every gap is filled because gaps are a cutting board's worst enemy. It'll harbor bacteria, so you want to make sure that all your gaps are filled. Even the smallest one can be a problem. And I want this thing to be as perfect as possible, so I just took some extra time and went over all the areas with the mixture again, make sure they're filled, and then sand them. After hitting it with 80 grit sandpaper, just to get some of the roughness out, I took it over to the router and little by little passes chamfered all the edges, and then I also rounded over the corners of the perimeter of the board. Not to mention, it's easier to pick up these boards if you have some kind of a handle. So in the ends of the board, I raised up the chamfer bit more and more each pass and created a much deeper chamfer so you can have a finger hold to pick up the board. Now, one very big thing that you want to consider, if you're going to use a router on an end grain cutting board, even just a chamfer or round over the edges, the chances of chip out are greatly enhanced. So if you want to cut down on that, take little by little passes like I did, or simply take you a block plane and go over all of the edges, taking off a little bit and just chamfering the edges. However, making a juice groove or even finger holds, you're going to have to use a router. So just make sure that your passes are light and your bits are sharp. One last thing that I did before finishing these boards out is I raised the grain. I get a lot of questions about what that means. And you basically take water in a squirt bottle and you hose down the boards on all sides and surfaces. What that creates is the ability of the board to soak up the water, but in turn, it creates little bitty fibers that raise up, little grain fibers that you will have to knock down with 220 or 320 grit sandpaper or maybe even a card scraper. Once you do that, the likelihood of those grain fibers raising back up, even after being cleaned by water, is going to be very nil. So the last thing you want is to forget that step and have your client use this for the first time and clean it off with water, and then it's rough after that. So they're going to be calling you when that happens. You don't want that to happen. So just take a little bit of extra time and let that water soak in to raise that grain, and then sand it down. Once you're done with that, dunk it in oil, let it soak up as much as possible, and then you're done. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this very unorthodox method on how to make an end grain cutting board. I think I'm going to call these the joinery boards. You don't really see them very much, and they are very unique. It's really got some creative juices flowing in my mind about how I want to tackle some future end grain boards. So thanks a lot, guys. If you have any questions, you can send them to me, care of rhwoodshop@gmail.com. Don't forget, you can follow me on my website as well as my social media, Facebook and Instagram. Instagram, I'm very, very active on. So pop me a message, questions, feedback, whatever you got. Drop some comments down below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. So I will see you on the next video. Thanks a lot. Take care. Boom!